The Friday evening sky over Manhattan glowed faintly pink, the kind of fading light that made the glass towers shimmer like they'd been polished for the night. Inside the Time Warner Center, the bustling lobby of America Tonight studios hummed with pre-show energy. Producers hurried across the marble floor with headsets in place, clutching stacks of notes and coffee cups that steamed in the crisp autumn air wafting in, each time the glass doors opened. Up on the 12th floor, the main studio was already warm from the lights. The stage had been dressed in the network's signature deep blue backdrop, the anchor's desk gleaming under spotlights. Across from the central seat sat two chairs, sleek, modern, and just far enough apart to suggest civility, though everyone in the room knew civility might not survive the hour. Danielle Brooks sat in the left chair, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her dark tailored suit fit her like armor, and the subtle pearl earrings at her lobes were her one concession to ornament. In another setting, she might have looked like any successful attorney. Here, she looked like someone ready to argue a case before the entire country. 15 years of courtroom experience had given her that stillness, a quiet, contained energy that could turn sharp in an instant. Across from her, Governor Margaret Maggie Collins leaned back slightly, one ankle resting casually over the opposite knee. Her blazer was a bold Kentucky blue, her blonde hair in perfect place for the cameras. Collins projected the relaxed confidence of someone used to holding her ground in front of bright lights. Years as a political spokesperson had taught her how to stay on message, how to smile while delivering a jab, how to ride over awkward questions as if they hadn't been asked. The third chair, centered between them, belonged to Michael Lane. At 52, Michael had spent 3 decades in broadcast journalism and carried himself with the easy calm of a man who'd seen every kind of on-air storm. He glanced at the clock above the camera bank, then at his guests, offering the same measured smile to both. 2 minutes, a floor manager called, her voice crisp over the hum of equipment. Danielle took a slow breath. She could feel the warm air from the overhead lights settling on her shoulders. But her mind was elsewhere, half on the debate ahead, half on the faces of clients she'd represented years ago in Dallas courtrooms, people whose lives had been upended by state laws that ignored federal protections, people who didn't have the platform she had now. Collins glanced around the studio as though surveying familiar territory. For her, this was just another arena. She'd defended a controversial president in the White House briefing room, had faced down a room full of reporters who smelled blood. This, she told herself, would be no different. Danielle Brooks might have legal credentials, but Collins had the political instincts to keep her on the defensive. In the control room behind the glass, producers monitored split screens, one on Michael, one each on the guests, and a wide shot of all three. Lower thirds graphics were cued. State versus federal power. Kentucky governor and Congresswoman. Face off. The segment would run live, without delay, straight into millions of homes. Michael's earpiece crackled. Going live in 5, 4. The red light on the central camera blinked to life. Good evening, and welcome to America Tonight, Michael began, his voice steady, warm. I'm Michael Lane, and tonight we're discussing a topic that has long been at the heart of American governance, the balance between state authority and federal law. Joining us are 2 distinguished public figures with very different perspectives. He turned slightly toward Danielle. Congresswoman Danielle Brooks, representing the 33rd District of Texas, former civil rights attorney with 15 years of constitutional litigation experience. Danielle inclined her head politely. Good evening, Michael. And Governor Maggie Collins of Kentucky, Michael continued, elected in 2024 and known for her outspoken defense of states' rights. Pleasure to be here, Collins said with a practiced smile. Michael folded his hands. Just last week, Governor Collins signed a package of laws in Kentucky that have drawn both praise and sharp criticism, including concerns about their constitutionality. We'll explore those tonight. Governor, let's start with you. Why do you believe these laws fall squarely within state authority? Collins straightened in her chair, the opening she'd been waiting for. Michael, the Constitution is crystal clear. Powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. That's the 10th Amendment. In Kentucky, we take that seriously. These laws are about protecting our citizens from Washington's overreach, from one-size-fits-all mandates that don't reflect the values of our state. As she spoke, her voice carried the same assured tone she'd used on campaign stages back home, where nodding crowds had cheered each mention of local control and Kentucky values. Danielle listened without interruption, her gaze steady. Years of trial work had taught her that the opening statement often revealed more than the speaker realized. She noted each phrase, mentally sorting them. Political slogan, constitutional misstatement. Her fingers curled slightly against her knee, a subtle tell to anyone who knew her. It was the same gesture she made in court before cross-examining a witness. Michael nodded at Collins, then turned toward Danielle. "Congresswoman Brooks, your response?" The camera cut to Danielle in a close shot. She leaned forward just enough to close the space between herself and the lens. The studio seemed to hush, even though the faint hum of lights and the soft shuffle of a cameraman's feet persisted in the background. "Thank you, Michael," she began, her voice calm, even warm. "And Governor, I appreciate your commitment to your constituents, but I think it's important to be clear about what the Constitution actually says and what it doesn't say." Michael glanced briefly between them, sensing the shift. Danielle's tone wasn't confrontational yet, but there was an unmistakable edge of precision in her choice of words. "The 10th Amendment does reserve certain powers to the states," she continued, "but it doesn't give any state the right to ignore federal law. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6 makes federal law supreme when Congress acts within its constitutional authority. That's not my opinion. That's the framework of our government." Collins' smile held, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, I think you're oversimplifying. These laws are about protecting state sovereignty." "And I'd be happy to talk about sovereignty," Danielle interjected gently. "But sovereignty isn't a blank check. It comes with constitutional boundaries." Michael's gaze shifted to the monitor in front of him, where a producer had just messaged, "This is heating up. Give them room." He knew better than to cut off this kind of organic escalation. Viewers leaned in for exchanges like this. The two women held each other's eyes for a brief moment, one radiating political confidence, the other legal certainty. The set lights threw sharp lines across their faces, illuminating the contrast not just in style, but in substance. Outside the studio, the city traffic rolled on, horns echoing faintly even up here. Inside, though, time felt compressed, every word carrying more weight than it might in any other room. Michael took a breath, ready to steer the conversation into its first real turn. "Governor Collins, Congresswoman Brooks raises a point about constitutional boundaries. How do you respond?" Collins shifted slightly, crossing her arms loosely. "Michael, what we're seeing from Washington is a constant push to expand federal power at the expense of the states. In Kentucky, we believe our citizens know best how to govern themselves." Danielle's lips pressed together in a neutral line, but her eyes stayed locked on Collins. She'd heard this before, variations of it in legislative hearings, in courtroom defenses that collapsed under scrutiny. And she knew from experience that the first cracks appeared when specifics were demanded. In the control room, the segment timer ticked toward the first break. Michael decided to use the final seconds to set up what he sensed could become the defining exchange of the night. "Congresswoman," he said, turning back to Danielle, "what's your main concern with these new Kentucky laws?" Danielle didn't look at Michael. She kept her eyes on Collins, her voice steady as she replied, "My concern, Michael, is that some of these laws directly conflict with federal civil rights protections. And that's not just a political issue, it's a constitutional one." The red light above camera one dimmed, signaling the break, but the tension at the desk didn't ease. The two women sat in silence, their gazes still fixed, as the studio filled with the soft rush of floor crew moving into position for the next segment. Somewhere in that silence, everyone, on set, in the control room, and in the audience at home, could sense it. This was going to be more than a polite exchange of views. The first commercial break passed like a held breath. Makeup artists dabbed at foreheads and powder lines, a stagehand slid a fresh mug of coffee near Michael's right hand, and a camera operator swapped batteries with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Through it all, Danielle Brooks sat almost perfectly still, shoulders relaxed, eyes quiet but alert. She'd worn that look in dozens of courtrooms. Measured, humane, in control of herself, even when the room wanted to pull emotions to the surface. Across the desk, Governor Maggie Collins gazed at a bullet-point card her staff had tucked beneath the edge of her notepad. She didn't read it so much as hold on to it, the way a person on a boat keeps one hand on the rail when the water gets choppy. The floor manager lifted her palm, then counted down with smooth, silent fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red light sparked to life again. "Welcome back," Michael said, his voice gathering the room. "Before the break, we heard broad arguments about state authority and federal law. I'd like to drill into specifics, because that's where viewers can really understand what's at stake." He turned to Danielle first, a subtle producer cue scrolling along the monitor. Give her room to explain. Danielle nodded once in thanks and angled her body toward Michael, but kept her eyes traveling briefly to Collins. "When we talk about the Constitution," Danielle began, "we're talking about an architecture, who can do what and when. The 10th Amendment does reserve powers to the states, yes, but it sits alongside other provisions that set federal standards. The Supremacy Clause, Article 6, says federal law is the supreme law of the land when Congress legislates within its constitutional authority. And the 14th Amendment adds that states can't deny equal protection under the law. In practical terms, it means a state can't pass a law that strips away federal civil rights or undercuts protections that Congress has already guaranteed." Her tone was patient, almost like a good neighbor explaining how a porch needs a support beam to hold the roof. On the studio wall, a screen flashed a tasteful graphic. Article 6, Supremacy Clause, 14th Amendment, Equal Protection. Michael liked that touch. The audience deserved clarity without being talked down to. Collins leaned in, not waiting to be invited. "Michael, that all sounds very textbook, but what we're dealing with are real people in Kentucky who want their communities to reflect their values. Washington doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom, and the federal government has been overstepping for years." Danielle gave the tiniest nod, a concession to a point she'd heard many times. "Local values matter," she said gently, "but constitutional rights don't change at a state line. If someone has a civil right in Ohio, they shouldn't lose it when they cross the bridge into Kentucky." Collins smiled, the kind that played well on friendly cable hits. "With respect, Congresswoman, I don't think anyone's losing rights in Kentucky. We're asserting our authority to govern ourselves without constant interference." Michael folded his hands, the way he did when he wanted to lower the temperature and increase the substance. "Governor Collins, could you walk us through one of the laws at the center of this criticism? Give viewers a concrete example." There was a beat, just long enough to register. "Well," Collins said, "one piece is about ensuring election integrity, tightening up procedures so the process is transparent and secure. Another ensures fairness in our schools. It's common sense, local control of local issues." Danielle's face didn't show much, but a close-up would have caught the focus shift, the kind of stillness that precedes motion. "Governor," she said, "on the election side, federal law speaks to discrimination in voting. On the school side, we're in the territory of equal protection and long-settled precedents. I'm not trying to play gotcha. I'm asking for the specific legal footing. Which constitutional provision do you lean on to justify curtailing a federally protected civil right?" Michael let that hang. He knew the audience at home could feel the ground shift, the move from slogans to statute. Collins adjusted the pages on her notepad, fingertips smoothing an invisible fold. "We're not curtailing anything," she said. "We're clarifying the rules and returning power to local boards." "Respectfully," Danielle replied, "clarifying and curtailing can look very similar when a person loses a protection. In court, we call that effect." The camera caught Collins's exhale, quick but audible to the studio mics. She pivoted. "Michael, when Washington writes one-size-fits-all policies, they don't consider that Kentucky has different needs than, say, New York. The 10th Amendment exists for a reason." "It does," Danielle said evenly, "and so do the 14th and the Voting Rights Act." A silence pooled between them, not hostile, just heavy enough to make everyone straighten in their chairs. Michael glanced at the clock. He had time to let this unfold. "Congresswoman," he said, "let's talk about the 14th. For viewers who haven't thought about it since civics class, what does it do in this context?" "It's a promise," Danielle said. "A guarantee that states can't deny people equal protection of the laws. It's why states can't pass statutes that treat certain groups as lesser under the law. When Congress passes civil rights legislation under its enforcement powers, it's reinforcing that equality. A state can legislate within its sphere, but not in a way that conflicts with those federal guarantees. And these Kentucky laws, in your view," Michael asked, "conflict?" "In some sections, yes, in ways the courts have analyzed for decades." Collins set her pen down carefully. "The courts aren't the only interpreters of the Constitution," she said. "Elected officials have to interpret it when we govern." "True," Danielle answered, and something kind in her voice softened the edge. "But courts get the final say. That's how we avoid 50 different constitutions." The control room camera director whispered, "Stay on too, Brooks," and the lens on camera 2 edged a fraction closer. It wasn't a dramatic push. This show didn't do dramatic pushes, but any viewer could see it. The frame tightened, not to glorify Danielle, but to give her words a little more room. She continued, still calm. "Governor, no one's calling Kentucky lawmaking illegitimate. The question is whether specific provisions can stand in light of federal law. That's not about politics. That's about the structure of our system." Collins's smile thinned. "Here's what people at home know, Michael. They know Washington lectures, they know it meddles, and they know the 10th Amendment as much as Congresswoman Brooks wants to downplay it." "I'm not downplaying it," Danielle said, steady as a level beam. "I'm placing it where it belongs among other provisions." Michael intervened with the gentlest palm. "Let's offer a concrete. Governor Collins, can you cite the constitutional basis for a state law that, according to critics, conflicts with federal civil rights protections?" There it was, the question that had hovered since they came back from break. Collins looked to Michael, then to Danielle, and back to her notes. She began to speak, then paused, then found a lane. "The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states that aren't explicitly delegated to the federal government. And when Congress acts within an enumerated power," Danielle said, "its laws are supreme. Governor, I think we're circling the same tree." "I think we're asserting our rights," Collins replied. The floor manager mouthed at Michael, 90 seconds to bumper. He nodded and decided to let the exchange breathe. The show worked best when it trusted its guests to show themselves. Danielle didn't press her advantage yet. Instead, she shifted the conversation from the balcony to the bricks. "My concern," she said, speaking to Michael, but with her gaze drifting a half-inch toward Collins, "is that Kentucky's new statutes on school governance include provisions that, on their face, appear to treat some students differently in ways federal law has already addressed, through equal protection principles and federal civil rights statutes. We've lived through this. We know what happens when states try to step around those protections." A familiar name hovered unspoken. Danielle let it hover, then gave it to the room. Brown v. Board of Education. That wasn't just about schools. It was about a constitutional promise. And Cooper v. Aaron, which, by the way, came out of Arkansas, said states can't nullify federal law or Supreme Court decisions. We've resolved that fight, at least in law. Collins' hand found the card under her notepad again. She didn't pull it out. She didn't need talking points to know what played with her audience back home. People are tired of elites telling them their communities can't set their own standards, she said. They're tired of being told they're backward because they want common sense. Danielle didn't bristle. She understood the emotional rhythm of that line, the way it drew on pride and place. Common sense and constitutional sense can live in the same house, she said. But when they don't, the Constitution wins. The tension didn't snap so much as deepen, like a string pulled one more turn past comfortable. Michael eased the show to the next inflection point. We're going to take another quick break. When we return, I'd like to explore the election law piece and what both of you think the courts might do. He looked into the camera. Stay with us. The red light dimmed. The studio air seemed to cool by a degree. A makeup artist appeared at Danielle's shoulder, then withdrew when Danielle waved her off with a grateful smile. Collins's communications director had texted the set phone during the segment. The phone buzzed where a stagehand had tucked it. Collins didn't reach for it. She kept her hands on the table and stared at the anchor desk edge as though measuring something in its wood grain. Michael leaned in, low and civil. "We're going to get to the voting piece next," he said, in that collegial off-air tone practiced by hosts who want guests to feel seen even in disagreement. "We'll keep it tight." Collins nodded. Danielle nodded. The floor manager lifted her hand again. They were back. "For viewers just joining us," Michael began, "we're discussing Kentucky's new laws and whether they conflict with federal protections. I want to turn to elections. Governor Collins, your administration says the changes increase security and transparency. Critics say they disproportionately affect certain groups. What's your response?" Collins sat a touch straighter, as if a muscle memory recognized friendlier terrain. "Every legal voter should be able to vote, and every legal vote should count. That's all we're doing. Making sure basic standards are met in a way people can trust." And when a standard makes it harder for some populations to vote than others? Danielle asked, not as a trap, but as a door she was inviting Collins to walk through carefully. "We're applying the same rules to everyone," Collins said. "That's equality." Danielle turned her palms slightly upward, a small gesture, more explanatory than accusatory. "Same rule, different impact. Courts look at both. That's why the Voting Rights Act exists." Collins opened her mouth, then closed it. She took a breath and reached for something flatter, safer. If people can show an ID at the pharmacy, they can show one to vote. "Many do," Danielle said, "and many don't have the same access to get the ID. That's why courts ask not only, is the rule the same, but what does it do? Equal protection cares about the doing." Michael watched them with the interest of a chess player who enjoyed both offense and defense. He almost asked whether either would predict how a federal court might respond to the Kentucky package, but the better question, he knew, was more basic. "Governor Collins," he said carefully, "when Congresswoman Brooks mentions the Supremacy Clause and the 14th Amendment, are those, in your view, constraints on what Kentucky can do here?" Collins didn't answer for a beat. "They are part of the constitutional framework," she said. "But so is the 10th Amendment, which you both seem eager to set aside." Danielle's voice lowered just a shade, the way it did when she wanted the room to lean toward her. "No one's setting it aside. The 10th Amendment is a residual clause. It assumes other powers are spoken for. The Supremacy Clause and the 14th Amendment speak. When Congress protects a civil right, states can't subtract from it." Collins shifted again, a small fidget masked as a posture change. "You keep saying can't," she said, and she gave the word a touch of indignation. "Kentucky can govern itself." "And it does," Danielle replied, "within constitutional limits, like every other state." Michael could feel it, the line between polite sparring and the first real stumble. He let the quiet expand, trusting it to do the work that volume never could. Around the set, the crew had fallen into that particular stillness only live television produces, a hush that isn't silence at all, but a layering of micro-sounds, the faint ring of a studio earpiece, the whisper of a teleprompter scroll, the soft click of a pen at the graphics console. Time didn't slow. It condensed. Danielle eased forward a fraction, just enough to read as engaged, not aggressive. "Governor," she said, and there was no heat in the word, just the clean edge of accountability. "You've said your laws are consistent with the Constitution. Can you point to the constitutional provision that allows a state to override federal civil rights protections?" Collins inhaled, and some part of the audience inhaled with her. She blinked once, then again, and made a choice. "The 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states." "That's not an override," Danielle said softly. "That's a residual. Which clause authorizes the conflict?" "I'm not conceding there's a conflict," Collins said. The smile had gone, replaced by a set jaw that broadcast resolve more than ease. "Then let's talk specifics," Danielle replied, voice steady, careful. She named sections, not to drown the room in numbers, but to mark the reality that these were words on paper affecting actual lives. Section 8, as drafted, appears to treat certain students differently in access to programs. Section 12, as applied, seems likely to have a disparate impact on protected voters. Those are the kinds of provisions that federal courts examine closely. Collins chose a familiar ramp. Elites in Washington always think they know better. "This isn't about elites," Danielle said, no faster, but firmer. "It's about the Constitution. The courts have told us for 70 years, through Brown and Cooper and the Voting Rights Act, that states can't write around equal protection. If your advisors told you the 10th Amendment gives you that power, they didn't give you the full picture." For the first time all night, Collins glanced past the cameras to the dark glass of the control room. It wasn't a plea. It was an old instinct, honed in press briefings where an ally could throw you a question you wanted. There were no allies on the other side of that glass. There were only producers who loved live truth. Michael felt a responsibility in moments like this, to the viewer, to fairness, to the dignity of the people at the desk. He smoothed his tie with 2 fingertips and spoke softly. "Governor, Congresswoman Brooks is making a legal claim. Do you have a legal response?" What came next wasn't silence. It was 3 heartbeats of air, measured against 1,000 households leaning a little closer to their televisions. Collins found the words she always found when terrain turned brittle. "Kentucky will defend its laws in court," she said. "We believe we're within our rights. And the courts will decide," Danielle said. She didn't gloat. She didn't have to. The sentence had all the finality it needed. A new graphic glowed on the studio screen. "Coming up, what happens next if these laws are challenged?" And the floor manager signaled a 30-second warning. Michael used it to offer a gentle landing before the break. "When we come back," he said, "we'll look at what the legal path might be from here and what it means when state and federal principles collide." He turned to Danielle and Collins with the kind of half-smile that said, honestly, "Thank you for the effort, for the courage, for the debate done seriously. Stay with us." The light dimmed for the bumper. No one spoke. Collins finally reached for the tucked-away phone, looked at a short text, the kind that offers direction without wisdom, and set it down again. The words on the screen didn't change the air around her. She placed both palms flat on the desk as if to feel something steady. Danielle uncrossed and recrossed her ankles, a small shift to release the coil in her calf muscles, then folded her hands again, as if clasping a thought she meant to hold until it was time to use it. Michael looked from one woman to the other and back to the camera that would go live first when the break ended. He'd hosted interviews with presidents, with grieving families, with mayors arguing about snow removal. This had a different weight. The country wasn't watching 2 people bicker. It was watching a question we never stop asking. Who are we under the rules we say we live by? The show returned. Michael introduced a short explainer on how a case travels through the federal courts. The animation was tasteful, the language plain. trial court, appeals court, Supreme Court if the justices chose to hear it. Danielle watched the screen with the subtle approval of a professor who thinks the lecture slides finally match the lesson. Collins stared, not blinking, until the animation gave way to their faces again. "Governor Collins," Michael said, "if these laws are challenged, are you prepared for federal litigation?" "We are," Collins said, voice even again. "We have excellent lawyers. We'll defend what we passed." "And you expect to win?" Michael asked. "We expect to be heard," Collins said. It was a good answer politically. It gave nothing, conceded nothing. "Congresswoman Brooks," Michael said, "do you think the courts will block these provisions?" Danielle didn't take the invitation to predict outcomes. She took the moment to explain the basics, her comfort zone. Courts look at the text, the purpose, and the effect. They weigh precedent. If the provisions conflict with federal protections, the courts will say so, and states will adjust. That's how our system corrects itself. Michael glanced at the clock and decided to take one more step inside. "Let me press each of you on a human point. Governor, if a student or a voter in Kentucky feels their rights are being narrowed, what do you say to them?" Collins found the camera 3, the one that offered a softer lens, and offered compassion cleanly. "I'd say we hear you. We're trying to make the system fairer for everyone, and we'll listen if something isn't working." "And Congresswoman," Michael asked, "what would you say to a viewer in Kentucky who feels scolded by Washington when all they want is a say in their community's rules?" Danielle's answer reached across the lights as if across a porch rail. "I'd say, your voice matters. Local control matters. But the Constitution is there to make sure no one's voice is drowned out because of who they are. We can honor local values and still honor that promise. In America, we're big enough to do both." There was a warmth in the room after she said it. Not unanimity, but recognition. Michael felt it. The floor manager felt it. Even a cameraman on the far left, a veteran of 100 debates, let his shoulders drop an inch. "Final minute of this block," Michael said. "I want to offer each of you a brief closing thought on this portion of the conversation." Collins went first. "Kentucky is not breaking the law," she said. "We're standing up for our rights, for our communities, and for common sense. We respect the Constitution. We live under it." Danielle went second. "The Constitution is not a buffet," she said softly. "We don't pick the parts we like and discard the rest. When federal law protects a right, it protects it everywhere. That's not Washington scolding a state. That's America keeping a promise." Michael's gaze settled, steady as a metronome. "When we return," he said, "we'll look at one provision in particular and ask a narrow, specific question, one that may determine how courts view this entire package." The red light flickered for the break. He turned to Danielle, then to Collins. "Governor," Danielle said, and there wasn't any triumph in it, only intention. "May I ask you something very specific when we come back?" Collins held her eyes a fraction too long before answering. "You can ask," she said, and the show cut to commercial, the studio light washing them both in the same cool glow, while the country waited to hear the question that would draw the line no one else had drawn yet. The second segment began with a subtle change in energy. During the commercial break, the floor crew had swapped coffee mugs for fresh water glasses, and one of the sound techs had leaned in to adjust Danielle Brooks's microphone. She'd thanked him quietly, the faintest of smiles crossing her face. Maggie Collins, meanwhile, had been in quiet conversation with the producer, nodding as she tapped a pen against her knee. When the cameras went live again, Michael Lane wasted no time. He knew the audience had settled in for something more than polite exchanges. The ratings team in the control room was already sending him excited updates. Viewer engagement was spiking. "Before the break," Michael said, turning to the camera, "Congresswoman Brooks raised concerns that some of Kentucky's new laws directly conflict with federal protections. Governor Collins, you've said these laws are about safeguarding state sovereignty. Let's get specific. One of those laws, House Bill 420, restricts certain voting practices that have been protected under federal law for decades. How do you reconcile that? Collins's jaw tightened just slightly. Michael, the bill simply ensures election integrity. It's about preventing fraud and making sure every legal vote counts. Washington can't dictate every aspect of how Kentucky runs its elections. Danielle didn't interrupt, but her eyes narrowed just a fraction. She knew the phrase election integrity had been used often as a political shield. In courtrooms, it was a phrase that almost always preceded the dismantling of safeguards for marginalized voters. When Collins finished, Michael pivoted to Danielle. "Congresswoman?" She leaned forward, elbows just touching the desk, voice steady but with a trace more edge. "Michael, let's be clear. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed to stop exactly the kind of discriminatory practices we've seen in state laws like this. Courts have ruled time and again that federal protections apply to every state, without exception." She turned her gaze to Collins. "Governor, when your law reduces early voting days in majority-minority districts but leaves them intact in majority-white districts, that's not integrity. That's discrimination. And under federal law, it's unconstitutional." A ripple went through the studio. Even the camera operator adjusted his stance, sensing the moment. Collins's lips pressed into a thin line. "With respect, Congresswoman," Collins replied, voice sharper now, "you're painting with a very broad brush. Our laws apply equally to all counties." "On paper, maybe," Danielle countered instantly, "but the effect, the real-world impact, is unequal. And the Supreme Court has been clear. Laws that have a discriminatory effect are just as unconstitutional as those written with discriminatory intent." Michael glanced at the clock but didn't step in. This was the kind of real-time fact versus rhetoric exchange that kept viewers glued to their screens. Collins shifted in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs. "Congresswoman, you've been in Washington less than 2 years. I've been governing my state through complex issues every day. I think I understand what my constituents need." Danielle's reply came without hesitation, her tone cool as polished steel. "Governor, this isn't about tenure. It's about the law. I spent 15 years arguing constitutional cases in federal court. I've read the rulings, cited the precedent, and seen the consequences when states ignore them." The control room director leaned toward his monitor. "She's tightening the screws now," he murmured to no one in particular. Michael, sensing the need to keep the conversation moving, but unwilling to diffuse the tension, introduced another flashpoint. "Let's move to another law in that package, Senate Bill 310, which limits certain anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ citizens. Governor, civil rights groups have already announced legal challenges. Why did you sign it knowing those challenges were likely?" Collins met his eyes squarely. "Because we believe in Kentucky values. We believe in protecting religious freedom and the rights of parents. The federal government shouldn't force our citizens to accept policies that go against their beliefs." Danielle's voice was quiet but cutting when she entered. "Religious freedom is protected by the First Amendment. But the Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly that religious belief does not give anyone the right to deny others their civil rights. That's not my interpretation. That's settled law." She didn't raise her voice, but the firmness in her tone carried through the air like a struck bell. The camera caught Collins's brief hesitation before she replied. "We're not denying anyone's rights. We're just ensuring—" "You're ensuring," Danielle interrupted, "that certain Kentuckians can be treated as second-class citizens. And that is precisely what the 14th Amendment forbids." There was a long beat of silence. The hum of the studio lights seemed louder. Michael glanced from one woman to the other, his practiced neutrality hiding the flicker of anticipation in his eyes. Danielle leaned back slightly, as though giving Collins room to respond, but her gaze never wavered. Collins opened her mouth, then closed it again, choosing her next words carefully. "Congresswoman, I understand your perspective," she said finally, "but I was elected to represent the people of Kentucky, not to bow to pressure from Washington lawyers." Danielle's eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "Governor, federal law isn't pressure. It's the law, And it applies to Kentucky the same way it applies to Texas or California. That's the Constitution we both swore to uphold. In the control room, one of the producers typed into the live feed notes, "This is the prelude to something big. Don't cut away." Michael gave the faintest of nods toward camera 2, signaling a tight 2-shot on the guests. "We have to take a short break," he said smoothly. "But when we come back, we'll get into the question at the heart of tonight's debate. When state law and federal law collide, which prevails and why?" As the red light went off and the studio shifted into commercial mode, neither woman looked away from the other. It was clear to everyone watching, both here and across the country, that the temperature in the room had just risen and the real heat was still to come. The return from the second commercial break felt different. The background music cue was softer, almost understated, as if the producers knew they were re-entering something more than a political conversation. The lower third graphic read, "State versus Federal Power, the Constitutional Showdown." Michael Lane glanced into camera 1, his voice calm but deliberate. "We've been discussing Kentucky's new laws and the constitutional questions they raise. Congresswoman Brooks, Governor Collins, I want to drill down on one issue that seems to be at the heart of your disagreement. When state law and federal law directly conflict, which one takes precedence?" Collins was ready, or at least she thought she was. She sat a bit straighter, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Michael, the 10th Amendment is clear. Powers not given to the federal government belong to the states. That's the basis of our federal system. When Washington overreaches, it's our duty as governors to push back." It was a familiar refrain, one she delivered dozens of times on conservative talk shows. But this time, the set was silent. No friendly host ready to nod and move on. Danielle Brooks was sitting 3 feet away, and she wasn't here to move on. Danielle leaned in, her hands clasped loosely, her voice even. "Governor, I appreciate your passion, but the 10th Amendment doesn't let states override federal law. The Supremacy Clause in Article 6 says the opposite. Federal law is supreme when Congress acts within its constitutional authority." Collins tried to hold her smile, but a small flicker passed across her face, a tiny tightening at the corner of her mouth. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I think you're mischaracterizing Kentucky's position. We're not trying to override federal law. We're asserting legitimate state sovereignty." Danielle didn't flinch. "Governor, one of your bills, Senate Bill 310, removes protections that are guaranteed under federal civil rights statutes. That's not sovereignty. That's a constitutional violation." Michael glanced at his notes, but stayed silent. He could feel the shift happening. The air seemed heavier under the studio lights. Collins' voice sharpened. "I've been governing my state for 2 years. I know what my people need. I don't need a lecture from Washington on how to do my job." Danielle's tone changed, slightly lower, slower, every word deliberate. "Governor, this isn't about where I work. It's about the law. And I spent 15 years practicing constitutional law before I came to Congress. I've argued these cases in federal court. Have you?" The question hung there. Collins hesitated just a fraction too long. Michael looked from one to the other. He'd seen debates turn personal before, but this wasn't personal. It was surgical. Danielle continued, her voice steady but unyielding. "Because what I'm hearing from you tonight tells me something important. You don't know the law you're trying to defend." The words landed like a hammer. The studio went still. One of the camera operators actually froze in place, his hand locked on the focus ring. Collins' face paled slightly. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out right away. That's your opinion," she managed finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier strength. Danielle didn't press the advantage with volume. She pressed it with precision. "It's not an opinion, it's a fact, based on what you've said here tonight. You've invoked the 10th Amendment without addressing the Supremacy Clause, ignored the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, and dismissed federal statutes that bind every state in this union. That's not political disagreement, Governor. That's constitutional ignorance." A faint murmur ran through the control room. One of the junior producers muttered, That's That's the clip. Collins tried to recover. Michael, this is exactly the elitist attitude from Washington that people in my state are tired of. Danielle cut in, her tone still measured. Governor, calling it elitist doesn't change that it's true. If you pass laws that violate the Constitution, they will be struck down, and Kentucky taxpayers will pay the price for defending the indefensible. Michael finally leaned forward, sensing that this was a moment he had to acknowledge. Congresswoman Brooks, are you saying Governor Collins doesn't understand the Constitution she swore to uphold? Danielle turned her head toward him briefly, then back to Collins. Her voice was calm, almost gentle now. Michael, I'm saying that based on her own words tonight, she has repeatedly misstated fundamental constitutional principles. When elected officials misunderstand the very law they're sworn to protect, that's more than a political problem. It's a civic crisis. Collins shifted in her seat, her hands tightening around the pen she'd been holding. The camera caught the motion, a subtle tell of discomfort. Danielle didn't stop. The Constitution isn't a buffet where states can pick and choose which federal laws to follow. It's the supreme law of the land. Every governor, every legislator, every member of Congress is bound by it. And pretending otherwise isn't leadership. It's dangerous. Michael glanced toward the floor manager, who signaled 2 minutes left in the segment. He decided not to interrupt. Collins attempted one more counter. We're going to continue standing up for Kentucky values. And I'm going to continue standing up for the Constitution, Danielle said, her voice quiet, but cutting through like glass. Even when that means telling another elected official on national television that they don't know the law. The line echoed in the studio. Even off-camera crew members looked up from their stations. When the red light above camera 1 finally went off for the break, no one spoke right away. Collins looked down at her notes. Her expression set, but her shoulders slightly slumped. Danielle sat still, composed, her eyes on the middle distance, as if already preparing for whatever came next. In homes across America, viewers were already replaying the moment in their heads. And in the control room, producers were quietly editing the clip they knew would go viral before the night was over. The segment ended without the usual light banter that typically closed out Michael Lane's show. The closing theme music played, but in the studio, the air was still thick, the kind of quiet that lingers after a thunderclap. Crew members avoided direct eye contact with the guests, moving swiftly to their next tasks. Governor Maggie Collins gathered her papers quickly, her movements brisk, controlled. Danielle Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, letting the adrenaline ebb. She had been in hundreds of debates and courtrooms, but she knew this was different. By the time both women had cleared the set, the control room was already buzzing. The head producer leaned over to an editor. Grab the exchange from when she says it, word for word. Get it to social in 5 minutes. In the building's elevators, phones were lighting up. Producers, interns, and even security staff were glancing at their screens, seeing the first raw clips hit Twitter and Facebook. The caption was simple, "You don't know the law." Brooks to Collins on live TV. The first viral burst came from a political journalist in D.C. who posted a 45-second clip with the comment, "This is what happens when a constitutional lawyer debates a politician." Within 10 minutes, it had over 20,000 retweets. By the time Danielle stepped out of the studio into the cool Manhattan night, her own staff was already fielding interview requests. A young aide jogged up beside her. "CNN wants you back tomorrow for a legal analysis segment. MSNBC is calling, NPR too." Danielle nodded, half smiling. "Let's pace ourselves. This isn't about me. It's about the law." Across town, in a midtown hotel suite, Collins's communications team was scrambling. A senior advisor paced the carpet, phone pressed to his ear. "We need talking points out in the next 20 minutes. Emphasize state values, federal overreach. Don't engage on the legal specifics." Collins sat in an armchair scrolling through her phone. Every feed was the same. Clips of the exchange, slowed down, subtitled, dissected. Her usual supporters were tweeting in defense, but even some conservative legal voices were silent. By morning, the moment had moved beyond political circles. Daytime talk shows opened with the clip, playing it in full before panels of guests. On Good Morning America, a legal analyst smiled ruefully. You can see the shift in Governor Collins's posture right before Congresswoman Brooks delivers that line. That's the moment she knows she's out of her depth. Late-night comedians pounced on it too. One host played the clip, then cut to a skit of a fictional Constitution for Dummies being delivered to the governor's office. The audience roared. But in law schools, the tone was different. Professor Elaine Ramirez of Columbia Law posted the clip on her class portal with the note, "Watch how Brooks controls the exchange. Specifics, precedent, refusal to let the other party hide behind rhetoric. This is advocacy in action." By midweek, hashtags were trending worldwide. # You Don't Know the Law, # Brooks vs. Collins, and Constitution 101. The American Civil Liberties Union tweeted, "When politicians misstate constitutional law, it matters. Thank you, @Rep. Brooks, for setting the record straight." Even some unexpected voices chimed in. Conservative constitutional scholar Richard Manning wrote in an op-ed, "While I disagree with Brooks on many policy issues, her legal analysis here is unassailable. The Constitution is not a political slogan. It's binding law." Inside Kentucky, the reaction was split. Collins's core supporters rallied, framing the moment as an attack by a Washington insider. But local newspapers in Louisville and Lexington ran editorials questioning the legal soundness of her recent legislation. One particularly pointed column read, "If the governor cannot defend her laws on constitutional grounds in a national forum, how can she expect them to survive in federal court?" Meanwhile, 3 civil rights organizations announced they were filing lawsuits against the very bills Brooks had cited on air. Their press releases quoted her remarks almost verbatim. Danielle's office was inundated with letters and emails. Some came from law students inspired by her composure. Others came from ordinary citizens grateful to see a politician speak plainly about the Constitution. One handwritten letter from a retired judge in Ohio stood out. "I've presided over hundreds of constitutional cases. Watching you hold the line on national television reminded me why the law still matters. Don't stop." Her communications director suggested releasing a formal statement. Danielle declined. "The clip speaks for itself. Let the focus stay on the issue, not on me." Still, she agreed to one in-depth interview on PBS where she spoke slowly and deliberately. The Constitution isn't about who talks louder or who holds office longer. It's about limits. Limits on power, limits on abuse, limits on the idea that anyone is above the law. By the end of the week, the numbers were staggering. The clip had been viewed over 50 million times across platforms. Memes, reaction videos, even classroom breakdowns flooded YouTube. Somewhere in Kentucky, Collins attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new factory. Local reporters tried to ask about the debate, but she brushed past them, offering only, "We're focused on the work for Kentuckians." Behind the scenes, her staff quietly began consulting outside legal counsel on how to defend the contested laws. In Washington, Brooks walked into a Judiciary Committee meeting to a ripple of nods and quiet congratulations from colleagues. One senior member leaned over as she took her seat. "That was one for the history books, Danielle. Reminded me why we put you on this committee." Danielle smiled faintly, but didn't linger on it. She knew the political moment would pass, but the legal battles ahead were just beginning. And yet, she also knew something had shifted. Beyond Kentucky, beyond her own career, across the country, ordinary people were talking about the Supremacy Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and the real meaning of federalism. For a constitutional lawyer who'd spent her life fighting for those principles, that was a win all by itself. 2 months had passed since the night Danielle Brooks told Governor Maggie Collins on live television, "You don't know the law." The clip had long since stopped trending, but the ripple effects had not slowed. In Kentucky, the first legal domino fell when a federal district court struck down Senate Bill 310, the anti-discrimination rollback Brooks had cited during the debate. The opinion was blunt. The challenged provisions are incompatible with federal civil rights statutes and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The ruling triggered a cascade. Within weeks, House Bill 420, the voting restrictions measure, was blocked by an injunction pending full review. The presiding judge referenced legislative intent and disparate impact, terms that had come up almost word for word in Brooks's exchange with Collins. Collins's administration filed appeals, but legal observers knew the odds. In hallways of courthouses and law school auditoriums, people were still talking about the night she had been challenged, point by point, in front of millions. In Washington, Brooks's standing had quietly shifted. She was now the Judiciary Committee's unofficial go-to member for constitutional interpretation in hearings. Colleagues deferred to her on fine points of federalism and civil rights law. Even those who disagreed with her politics respected her command of precedent. One afternoon, after a tense markup session, an older congressman approached her. "I don't agree with you on much," he admitted, "but you remind me of what this place used to be, when arguments were about the law, not just the optics." Danielle smiled politely, tucking the comment away. She'd learned over years in court that moments of mutual respect, even across divides, mattered more than most people realized. In the media, the tone had matured. The late-night jokes faded, replaced by deeper pieces, examining the fragility of constitutional literacy among public officials. The Washington Post ran a Sunday feature titled, "The Supremacy Clause Goes Viral," charting how a single televised moment had spurred a surge in online searches for terms like Equal Protection Clause and federal supremacy. Podcasts interviewed constitutional scholars about why the basics of the law seemed absent from so many political debates. Law school applications ticked upward for the first time in years, some citing that CNN debate in personal statements. For Collins, the landscape was more treacherous. Her approval ratings in Kentucky had dipped, not catastrophically, but noticeably. The drop was sharpest among college-educated voters and suburban moderates. Donors still took her calls, but a few were redirecting their largest checks toward other governors seen as less vulnerable on the national stage. At a closed-door Republican Governors Association meeting, one colleague reportedly pulled her aside. "Maggie, you've got to shore up your policy team. No one wants to see a repeat of that." She nodded stiffly, but inside she bristled. She still believed in her policies, but even she had stopped bringing up the 10th Amendment in interviews, wary of the inevitable follow-up questions. Back in Kentucky, legislative aides whispered about the governor's new habit of consulting outside constitutional counsel before signing major bills. One aide summed it up. "We all got the message. The boss isn't walking into another trap like that." Meanwhile, Brooks stayed in motion. She delivered guest lectures at Georgetown, Howard, and Yale, each time showing the clip not as a gotcha moment, but as an illustration of why precision matters. In one packed auditorium, she told students, "The Constitution isn't a suggestion. It's the operating manual of the country. And if you're going to invoke it, you better be ready to explain exactly what it says and what it doesn't." The applause was warm, but it was the quiet line of students afterward, waiting to shake her hand, that stayed with her. One young woman said softly, "I've always been scared to speak up when someone's wrong about the law. You showed me it can be done with facts, not just emotion." The lawsuits in Kentucky wound their way upward. By the time the appellate courts weighed in, legal briefs from both sides were citing not only decades-old precedent, but passages from the debate transcript itself. That night's exchange had become part of the documented public record, evidence of what the governor knew or should have known about the laws she signed. 6 months later, Michael Lane invited both women back to the studio for a special follow-up. Collins declined. Brooks accepted. In the opening segment, Michael looked at her over the desk. "Congresswoman, that night became one of the most talked-about moments in political television. Do you think it changed anything?" Danielle's voice was even. "I think it reminded people that the Constitution isn't just a backdrop for political theater. It's real, it has consequences, and it applies to every single one of us, whether we understand it or not. Michael tilted his head. And if an elected official doesn't understand it? She met his gaze without hesitation. Then they have two choices: learn it or get out of the way. By the 1-year mark, the phrase, "you don't know the law," had settled into the American political lexicon, not as an insult, but as a warning. Commentators used it when politicians made dubious legal claims. Activists printed it on placards during protests against unconstitutional legislation. And somewhere in all of it, Danielle Brooks kept working, writing bills, arguing her points in committee, and walking into interviews, ready to do exactly what she'd done that night: hold the line, one clause, one precedent, one fact at a time. Because she knew the truth the moment had revealed to millions. In politics, charisma can win the day, but in law, knowledge wins the war. The studio lights have long since dimmed, and the sharp edges of that night's exchange have softened in memory. Yet, like the echo of a bell in an empty church, the meaning still lingers. Those who watched saw more than a debate. They saw a moment when a voice, steady and unshaken, stood its ground against the easy comfort of false certainty. For many in the Black community, it was a reminder that quiet dignity can still command the room. The lesson is not about winning an argument. It's about honoring the truth when the truth is called into question. We live in a world quick to size people up, to decide what they can or cannot know based on where they come from or the shade of their skin. But the heart of justice is patient. It waits for the facts to speak, and it trusts the listener to hear them. In this case, the facts came from someone the other side might have underestimated. Someone who knew that the law is not a matter of volume, but of understanding. That understanding was born of years of work within the Black community, listening to its struggles, carrying its history into rooms where it had long been ignored. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: keeping your composure in the face of doubt is not weakness, it's strength in its purest form. To defend what is right without anger is to plant a seed that will outlast the noise. Think of the old porch light on a winter night, shining not to show itself off, but to guide a traveler home. Justice can be that light, steady, unpretentious, and impossible to overlook when you need it most. So perhaps, as the news cycle moves on and the clip finds its way into archives, the real work begins. We each have our own moments when someone will test our knowledge, our worth, or our place in the conversation. And in those moments, we can remember this: the truth does not shout, it simply stands. It stands in courtrooms, in classrooms, in community halls, and yes, in the living rooms where ordinary people watch and think, that's how you do it. Take a breath now and let your mind wander to the times in your own life when you've been underestimated. What would it look like to answer, not with fury, but with the kind of clarity that changes minds? If this story touched you, share it. Not for the sake of the telling, but to remind someone else that strength can be gentle and gentleness can be strong. Sometimes the surest way to change the course of a conversation is not to raise your voice, but to speak with the quiet authority of someone who knows the road they've walked and knows exactly where it leads.